Okay, here we are yet again. Oh, with every one of these, we're one step closer to the end of the semester, so stay positive here. But we're on to chapter 8 of Barbour's book, the AmGov book on public opinion campaigns and elections. A lot of textbooks that I've read over in the past separate public opinion from campaigns and elections, and the way Barbour wraps up the chapter, at least talking about presidential elections, I kind of expected to see some of that in the chapter on the executive branch, but anyway, I didn't write the book, and if I want to complain, I guess I should write my own. But what I will say that I do like about the book, and I do like about her discussion of how presidential elections work at the end of this chapter, is that in addition to how she opens the chapter talking about polls, she does so in ways that I think are really down to earth and are things that really matter to all of us as voters, and less so to folks like me who are nerdy political science professors. So, anyway, I continue to have somewhat mixed feelings about the text, but I like this chapter, even though it was not exactly what I expected. But anyway, let's think about public opinion here by way of introduction here. Who cares what the public thinks? Well, in a democracy, public opinion really should matter, right? Our elected officials obviously, serve in the positions they do because they win elections. And there are other ways to measure public opinion beyond elections, and that is to say by polling our opinions. But both of these things should matter. And I'm by no means advocating that a public opinion poll should determine whether or not an elected official resigns from office or something to that effect. No. Losing an election requires that someone leave office. Yes. And that's how democracy works. But even once in office, folks who hold elected office should listen to what we have to say. And rightly or wrongly, correctly or incorrectly, the only way to do this is to listen to what we have to say, and to understand what the most people think possible would be through polling. But anyway, it doesn't always happen that way, and public opinion can change, and politicians ultimately have the final say of whether or not they listen to public opinion polls or not. But anyway, I'm starting to repeat and rant, so I'll stop here. But there are ways that polling for public opinion is different from going to the polls. When you hear that term, going to the polls, that means election day. That means we vote. That is the ultimate poll, so to speak. Those are the polls. Elections are the polls with the most consequence. But other forms of public opinion polling are done randomly, ideally, a bit differently, and less comprehensively, obviously, because when we go to vote in this country in an election year, maybe around 60% of us vote off year elections, which is to say elections that occur outside of a presidential election year. High 40s is pretty good as a percentage of turnout. But polling can take place, public opinion polling can take place at any time. And that is done through what we call sampling. And some of this, if you've taken a statistics class, even in high school, I know I took a statistics class in high school, but that was a long time ago. Sampling is done where the attempt is to randomly sample the pool of people you're talking about. And as Barbour's text points out, statistically speaking, mathematicians tell us that anywhere between about 1,000 and 2,000 properly randomly sampled opinions can be pretty reflective of the 330 some million of us in this country altogether. So, obviously trying to determine what the people think simply based on about 1,500 random sampled questions is different than running an election. But again, if sampling is done correctly, and I'll talk a little bit about this in the subsequent slides, but as to not overrepresent or underrepresent any communities of people, then sampling should be pretty good. Timing can be important. This is particularly true for those who, say, are seeking elected office and have not yet won an election at the polls. But oftentimes polling companies are pretty busy, or are busiest right before election time, because a lot of campaigns will privately commission polls to try to better gauge what things are going to look like on election day, or maybe what messages need to be tweaked, changed, added, removed, etc. from a campaign. So timing is pretty important. And the import of the issue at hand can be pretty instructive as well. Again, piggybacking on my last point, um, the importance of polls around election time can be very important to candidates and to parties. We could also talk about, say, uh, polling over time, and I'll come back to this point in a second. But say the importance of, say, what's going on in the economy and our opinion of the president, right? And oftentimes we see good economy, good approval of the president; bad economy, low approval numbers for the president. But how important things are to us, like say an election or the overall state of the economy, can polling at any given time, right? Because we know that going to the polls, to reiterate as the final point for the previous slide, voting and when we vote is set out in the Constitution, so that can't change. But anyway, what about the quality of public opinion, right? So in an ideal world, as Barbour points out, we are all pretty well informed. We are tolerant of other people's ideas. We are willing to compromise. And we engage in civic activities such as ... question mark. Perhaps the most important one there would be, I would say, voting. But we can also think about other ways that we can participate in the civic world around us, right? And that could be through volunteering. That could be through donating money to charity. It could be anything like, being active in a local church, a local religious organization, being in a bowling league, right? But things that we do that cultivate a sense of civic unity. But really, sadly, on all four of these points, I don't think we hit our mark. We're not as well informed as we should be. I think this age of hyperpartisanship shows that we're not very tolerant of other ideas. We're also not very willing to compromise. And again, we don't vote like we should. Right? So in the real world, again, we're not very informed, we're not very tolerant, we're less willing to compromise, and social scientists tell us that this translates into low voter turnouts. Right? In some countries, election day means darn near everybody's out and going to the polls to vote. In the United States, in recent decades, and since the expansion of the electorate in 1920 to include all men and women over the age of 20 or 21 and over, or then since the early 70s when the electorate was expanded to include people 18 to 21, we just don't vote, right? 60% is really high for us in the modern era. And that's, as a political scientist, I'll tell you, that's pretty sad. And as someone who's lived in other democracies and been out on election day and paid attention to what goes on, yeah, I mean, most of us just don't utilize our greatest civic resource as we could, and that's the vote. Barbour transitions here from poo-pooing us for not voting like we should to asking a more theoretical question. Whose vote should count, right? I mean, of course, this day and age in the United States, rightly so, anyone who votes, we expect that vote to be counted. But there are movements, sentiments around the country to restrict participation or to further regulate the electorate, is a term that's used later in the chapter. How or why? Right? Barbour proposes, again, hypothetically, that maybe there should be some sort of basic civics test that we need to take, not like a literacy test in the Jim Crow days to prevent African Americans from voting, but to show that we have the civic wherewithal, the civic knowledge to vote. And part of me thinks, boy, that might not be a bad idea. I mean, I know people in my own family who vote straight ticket Republican and straight ticket Democrat, which is up and down the ballot for only one party. And that makes you think, oh boy, they must be really sure of why they're doing this. And the fact of the matter is, I know darn well they don't, right? So we really need to cultivate the democratic ideal of tolerance of even those who maybe aren't as informed as they should be, right? But however, I do understand Barbour's discussion of rational ignorance, right? That we lead busy lives, we have lots of things to do, things pulling us in different directions. Trust me, I hear about it from students all the time about how busy you are. I'll tell you this now, you're going to grow up and it's going to get worse. you're going to look back on your time in college and think, boy, I had a lot of free time to play video games and goof off and stare at my phone. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of us as adults, including college students, will be generous here. Um, we engage in this rational ignorance. We justify to ourselves why we don't have the knowledge to vote, and thus many of us use that to in turn justify not voting, right? But again, that is something I do understand practically, in practical terms, we'll put it that way. Um, and that's a real reason why uh, we don't have the turnout at election time that I wish we would. Despite that fact, some of us do seek shortcuts that try to, through which we try to feel more informed, even though we should understand realistically that we're really not, right? We engage in online processing, which Barbour points out has nothing to do with the internet. But this is how we sort information that comes into our heads, right? We sometimes might not even know where it came from, something we saw on our stupid phone, we heard on a radio, we heard in conversation, we read in a newspaper that we picked up at the doctor's office, something to that effect. But this notion of online processing is how we sift through the information that comes through our heads. Um, that again we use to feel informed, but yet if we dig a little deeper inside of our own brains, we might realize we don't know where it came from, right? What's a bit clearer than that is what Barbour describes as the two-step flow of information, which she also points out is has nothing to do with a country music dance, the old two-step here, but it's opinion leaders sharing information and opinion followers absorbing that information, right? Opinion leaders can be elected officials, they could be journalists, they could be professors, and then really anyone around here could be an opinion follower, right? Larson could be viewed simultaneously as the occasional opinion leader, more often than not an opinion follower, right? I feel like I'm pretty informed about things going on around me in this country politically, but yet at the same time, I still constantly seek out new information. And there are some voices that I trust, and whose analysis I will probably incorporate into my own, right? Political parties and interest groups also serve this purpose, right? We turn to political parties and to a lesser extent to interest groups for cues, understanding, direction on how we are to interpret certain issues, certain events going on around us, right? The fact of the matter is, though, despite these 3 points above, there is no foolproof shortcut to reach understanding. And sadly, I'll tell you now too, um, for someone like me who reads entire books on issues that people think they understand by reading a few headlines, the more I learn, the more I understand Socrates when he said, the more I learn, the more I realize what I don't know. So there really is no foolproof shortcut to reach full understanding, as I don't even yet know what the ways to reach full understanding of an issue in its entirety is, right? That's just how life works. And part of me thinks that getting older and getting wiser is again, realizing what you don't know. But anyway, let's ask ourselves this question here. How do we know what Americans think, right? Well, pollsters are the folks who run polls. They go about ways to try to be scientific in polling, because if polling is not done scientifically, methodologically scientifically, then the results really aren't worth a damn. So because of this, pollsters try to randomly sample us. And again, there are 330 some million folks who live in the United States. And if pollsters can find the right bunch of about 1,000 of us, maybe up to 2,000 of us, through random sampling, then ideally there could be inferences gleaned from that data to understand how most of us think on the whole, right, around the whole country. But the sampling needs to be random. One way to do that is to engage, or one way that used to be done to do this is polling companies would randomly dial digits to landlines and try to sample us in that way. But as the text points out, as we've advanced technologically, whether that is 30 years ago getting caller ID at home to now most of us not having landlines, that makes random sampling that much more difficult, right? You would think that the internet would have solved that problem, but what what happens when we engage in internet polling is that the sampling is not randomly if we actively engage to or choose to engage in a poll, right? So anyway, the internet, again, while you would think might be a tool to bring about better polling of our opinions, it actually can be skewed because of sample error, right? Non-response bias occurs when, say, we don't answer our landline when we see that it's a number we don't recognize at home, or more often than not, this day and age, especially for you younger folks who don't have landlines. I haven't had a landline in 20 years. When I had to have one to have the internet, which used to be a thing. But if we don't answer our cell phones when they ring because we don't recognize the number, then that can lead to non-response bias, right? So pollsters have to juggle a lot of issues trying to figure out who they're speaking with. And when it comes to, say, doing polling about elections, then pollsters need to distinguish between who's going to be a likely voter, who's likely not going to vote at all, right? And that can be difficult, and that leads to most polls being pretty incomplete or not, by no means 100% reliable statistically. And no poll is. Even the ones done best still have um, errors, plus and minuses that you see, error intervals in which we can only say with this amount of confidence that this poll is likely correct. Because of that, the best thing to do is to look at polling aggregators, and that's what Larson does in the run-up to election time. I did less of this in 2016 and only looked at a handful of polls. And like most everyone else, even the pollsters themselves, I drew the wrong conclusion about who was going to win. In 2020, what I did is I looked at polling aggregators, which certain journalists on certain websites will combine polls together, and the intent there is to try to weed out bad information, right? Because again, not all polls are good, uh, mathematically good, scientifically sound, and not all polls are the same, right? We can look at national polls, we can look at state polls, we can look at regional polls. All tell us arguably different things, right? What people think in Texas might not reflect what people think in Minnesota or Oregon or Rhode Island or what have you, right? Tracking polls is another type of poll that comes up discussed in the text. The most common tracking poll that you've probably heard of is that of presidential approval rating, right? That can be looked at over time, up and down, and most folks who are presidents in their first term are very keen on following tracking polls, and that might help us to understand, guess whether or not a president is likely to win re-election. The last time around, President number 45, President Trump, never had approval ratings above 50% in his 4 years in office. And tracking polls told us that, right? So that was a pretty good indicator that he was likely not going to win re-election in 2020, right? Exit polls traditionally were viewed as the closest thing to polling gold that we could get. This is when pollsters meet people as they come out of their polling stations on election day, and will just flat out ask, hey, can I ask you, or I'm with this organization, can I ask you who you voted for this office and that office? And it used to be that people were pretty confident and comfortable in speaking to exit pollsters. For some reason, as we move into the 21st century, maybe this is a consequence of the 2000 election between George Bush and Al Gore. I don't know. But it seems to be that fewer and fewer of us today are willing to speak to exit pollsters. I've never run into one, but then again, I haven't voted at a polling station in quite a while. I've been voting by mail for some time as a resident of Portugal. I've been able to vote absentee for a while. But anyway, fake polls, the text discussed very briefly. I'll only mention it very briefly now. Fake polls are ones that really don't tell us anything about reality. This might be, say, in a radio call-in show or a opinion journalism news show where some talking head says, I've been attacking the president for the last hour. You tell me, do you approve of how the president's doing? And this could be on either side of the political spectrum, to the left, to the right. If you're looking, if a poll is being conducted by someone who also runs a television show, and the poll pretty much only reflects the people who watch that show, then that poll doesn't really tell you anything with any sort of scientific validity whatsoever. Zooming out here, let's think more broadly. How do we form our opinions, right? Where do our opinions come from? I'll take you back to a term that I used earlier in the semester. I was surprised that Barbour didn't talk about socialization. I want to say it was in chapter 1 or 2, maybe, I forget. But this process, excuse me, I'm yawning, of political socialization, we have discussed already. It's this process that we start undergoing from the second we're born, and it ends the second we drop dead. But it's this process through which agents of socialization, you'll recall I used the term earlier in the semester, transmit to us ideas that we are to understand about how the political system works, right? So what are these agents of socializations? If you'll recall, I gave you a list of things like family, school, religion, friends, events, etc., the media, political parties, this, that, or the other. These are all things that in subtle ways transmit to us ideas about how things are supposed to be in the political system, right? These things often are meant to instill in us a sense of patriotism, a sense of belonging to a larger community, a national community, if you will. They can also bring about division, right? Because we come to find, the older we get, not everybody agrees about everything. Not everybody has the same understanding about how things should be in this country or in this state or in this city or what have you, right? So, political socialization is again, it's an ongoing process. It's generally pretty positive in that it helps us to understand the political system around us and our role in it and how we function within that system. That's positive. But it can also, again, be a source of conflict when we realize that maybe, we realize we don't agree with all of the religious upbringing that we underwent as children. It might be a cause of conflict when we realize that friends have radically different ideas about values that we thought they shared with us. It could be that events bring about some change, right? For some folks, September 11th really instilled a greater sense of patriotism. For some, what happened afterwards, like the invasion of Afghanistan, and more importantly, the invasion of Iraq, led us to question how things work and why. And that's fine too, right? But socialization is important. It's something that I asked you to think about earlier in the semester, and I hope you've continued to do that, right? But how we're socialized and who we are can translate into data, right? And what can data tell us? When we look at public opinion data, for example, or polling data about elections. Well, race and ethnicity can tell us things. Not everything. Not any one of these points can tell us everything we would need to know, much less make a prediction. But when we look at race and ethnicity, we see that white people in the United States, white Americans, tend to vote in greater numbers for Republicans than Democrats. We see women tend to vote for Democrats more than Republicans. We see strongly religious people, particularly strongly religious Catholics, strongly religious Protestants, tend to vote in greater numbers for Republicans than Democrats. Those who do not identify with a religion or are avowed agnostics or atheists tend to vote in much greater numbers for Democrats. Education is increasingly becoming a marker of one's politics. Whereas if you have less than a college education, you're more likely to vote for Republicans oftentimes, and folks with higher education tend to vote in higher numbers for Democrats. Where you live can matter. Texas, as we know, is generally a pretty conservative state, not uniformly, of course. I was born in Kansas, as you know. That's a pretty conservative place, but where my slice of Kansas is not so much. One's generation can be a big factor, as Barbour points out in her text, the younger you are, the more likely you are to identify as a Democrat at present. And in a generation from now, that could flip. So who knows? But for the time being, data, when we look at one's race, ethnicity, gender, religion, etc., we can start to make some predictions, right? If you tell me that we're talking about, say, an older baby boomer white guy in rural Montana who's a practicing evangelical Christian who flunked out of college after 2 semesters, I would lay you money that person's a Republican, right? So when we want to generalize opinions, those of us, particularly in my line of work, can start to look at other data and draw conclusions. But again, that's always incomplete. And what we find over time as social scientists is that really the biggest influence on opinions and votes as adults is political party in the United States in particular. So if you tell me that you're a registered Democrat, I'm going to assume a lot about how you vote. Most importantly, that you're going to vote straight ticket Democrat. If you tell me you're a Republican, I will assume that you vote up and down the ballot for Republicans. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. And it's not to say that things can't shift with time and people can't change parties. They do, they can. But as these characteristics that we've identified on the previous slide start to line up, and when we add in party to that, it becomes easier, I guess we'll put it that way, for folks, for observers like me, to understand how people vote, what they think, and why, right? And again, I say this with a grain of salt. I know not to generalize. I've been misanalyzed before, and I've misanalyzed others, and I would have bet you every penny I had on elections that have gone the other way than I thought. So, I say all this again with a grain of salt. But what we're seeing today, what we see today in the United States, are some clear trends in party identification, right? And Barbour talks about the coalition of the ascendant, which a synonym for that might be the rising. And she describes younger people, you Gen Zers, you maybe millennials out there. You make up what we call the coalition of the ascendant. You're on the rise, both in terms of your age. You're aging into the age of when one participates in the political system. You're also with the decrease. The projections, the demographic projections for the United States are that. Our population is going to start shrinking sometime soon because we're having fewer children. People are getting older, right? Which isn't a bad thing, but it's the older crowd that tends to fall into this coalition of restoration, right? Which is to restore, which, say, for example, might be to, I don't know, make America great again, right? So the coalition of the ascendant, we identify more so, but not exclusively, with the Democratic Party. The coalition of restoration, I think, more clearly aligns itself with the Republican Party, but not entirely. The fact of the matter is there's a widening gulf between the two parties. And this is something that I'd like for you to think about as you watch the next film, Inequality for All. It has more to do with, say, interest groups and public opinion than political parties necessarily, but I want you to think about, say, the question of inequality as another source of tension between the two parties and how you feel about the issue, right? But again, Barbour briefly talks about the effect of negative partisanship. This is in the context of what we call negative campaigning. But this is how and why parties in recent decades have definitely turned to attacking their opponents instead of telling voters and the public more broadly what they're for, right? And I think that's one of the things that also contributes to lower voter turnout levels in the United States. I think a lot of us, particularly folks in the middle who have in the past voted for one party or the other, increasingly get fed up with the negativity in politics today. But from there, this is a good question. If party is so important in shaping opinions, do issues even matter anymore? Well, of course they do, right? We know that there's still deal breaker issues, or these are sometimes called single issue, deal breaker issues are what's important for what we call single issue voters. Sorry, that's what I meant by that. So a single issue voter is someone who views, say, abortion as a deal breaker. Oh, this candidate is for abortion and I'm not. Well, I'm going to vote against that person. Or I'm going to say, I am very much a defender of the Second Amendment. I'm a gun owner. I'm an NRA member, and I very much will not vote for candidate X because he, she, they, it I think, might not be as pro-gun as I am. So these would be examples of very, very real-life deal-breaker issues and how single-issue voters approach their electoral choice, right? And increasingly, as you can imagine, going back to the previous slide, we find fewer and fewer divergent single-issue voters within one party or another, right? This is yet another way in which we sort ourselves. These key issues usually indicate, if you tell me you feel this or that way on a particularly hot button issue, and I could guess with some certainty which party you would most identify with, right? That's not to say that the image and personality of candidates isn't important. I think it still is, but arguably maybe to a lesser extent than it used to be. I think image and personality of candidates maybe mattered more when moderate or centrist voters were more willing to go with either of the two major parties come election day, depending on how they felt about that candidate. So it's not to say that image and personality, again, don't matter. I think they still do. But I think party identification is more and more and more important. And to illustrate this fact, let's look at this here. This is party identification in the 2016 presidential election. I swiped to this little bar chart from a different text that I've used in the past for this type of class, a U.S. government class. And you can see in 2016, when neither candidate, remember, for president was particularly highly viewed, even by many people in their own party. 9% of Democrats in 2016 in the presidential election voted for Trump, right? Not for Hillary Clinton. 7% of Republicans voted for Clinton, not for Trump, right? So, I mean, these numbers are pretty big, 89 and 90. But goes to show you that party is pretty important, but maybe not the most important indicator, right? For some, I think my father was one of them, a lifelong Republican. He swore up and down he would not vote for Trump. And I wasn't there in the election booth when he voted, so I'll take him at his word. But again, when someone tells you they're a Republican, a lifelong Republican, you tend to assume that they're going to vote that way. Well, let's fast forward 4 years. Did anything change here? You bet it did. We see party identification even more important than it was 4 years prior, right? Only 5% of Democrats voted for Trump and 6% of Republicans voted for Biden, right? So if anything, we see party identification having become even more important between 2016 and 2020. And these are the things that nerdy people like Larson get all excited about, right? Because this is a real reflection of reality, and it helps us better understand our political behavior, right? But anyway, speaking of our political behavior at its broadest, the ultimate poll is, of course, the poll that is taken every 4 years to determine who is going to be the president of the United States, right? This is supposed to be a pretty important event in the world's greatest democracy, but the fact of the matter is, yet again, I'll return to the slide from earlier, we don't turn out like we should, right? Turn out for what? Apparently not to vote. This has something to do, I think, with moderates being a bit frustrated with the whole system. It also has to do with what we call regulating the electorate, which is something very much that has been in the news in the state of Texas in early, mid, and late 2021. Right. Here's the same data we saw earlier. I'm not going to dwell on this. I just want to remind you of the fact that, again, we do not vote in numbers as I personally think we should in this democracy of ours, right? The numbers, vary a little bit. Could be as low as the high 40s in a presidential election, and or as low as the high 40s in a presidential election, and as high as maybe the mid 60s in a presidential election. But again, other countries, this is around 90%, especially for nationwide votes. But thinking about the electorate itself, what if only the smartest, most informed people were allowed to vote, right? This is what I was talking about earlier. That part of me as a political science professor thinks, yeah, maybe that's not a bad idea. And then I have to remind myself that this would fly in the face of representation, right? On the one hand, as a political scientist who is informed, I wish more folks went to go vote who genuinely felt more informed about what they were deciding. But to do that would truly skew representation, right? You do not want only political science professors voting come election time, right? Most of us are old white guys. I'm getting older, and I'm a dopey white guy. I admit that. But there's a lot more to what goes into how one decides to vote than what they know about the political system, right? The founders were a bit skeptical. The founders, the whole reason we have the electoral college was because the founders didn't want um, everyone's vote to instantly nationwide be translated into electoral victory for a president, right? The electoral college is meant to put a break on capricious decisions by the electorate, right? Uh, and let's remind ourselves as well that the founders very happily put great restriction on who could vote in the United States, right? Again, at the time of the founding, it was white males who owned property, which definitely left most, uh, you know, which by most I mean poor, which was the majority of everyone at the time of the founding, from the electorate, right? So now that the electorate has expanded over time, again to include women in 1920, the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were passed after the Civil War in the later 1800s. Didn't fully come into practice until the Civil Rights and Voting Act rights acts were passed in the mid 1960s. So now that everyone has the right to vote, then everything should be okay, right? No. There are continuing efforts to regulate the electorate. And when we say regulate the electorate, that's one way to put it. Some people will go as far as to say as that some pockets of the country, some political entities, perhaps one political party is more eager to engage in what some call voter suppression, right? By limiting our access to the ballot box, and thus limiting the number of people who turn out to vote in a given election. Right. The fact of the matter is, easy voting or convenience voting has become very much a politicized issue. This hyperlink here, again, I can't click on this and watch it with you now because then YouTube would take my lecture down. But if you want to pause this and then go back to the Blackboard, click on the link, feel free. This is about 15-20 minute clip from John Oliver, the goofy looking guy from the UK, talking about convenience voting in the United States. The fact of the matter is, when voting is made easier for us, more of us do it. We do it in higher numbers, right? So arguably, maybe reducing the hurdles to voting might bring about a higher turnout. But there's a bit of a political problem here. There's concern over voter fraud, which in and of itself is perfectly understandable. No one wants people voting who shouldn't be voting. The flip side of this coin is, though, is that the real political stakes in regulating the electorate, right? I think we should want all of us to vote, all of us who could legally vote to vote. But the politicized question right now, or the political problem, is that the data tell us that when more people vote, which is to say, often the people who don't vote as regularly as others, those are usually poorer, younger, and often less white. So the Democrats tend to benefit with higher levels of voter turnout, and Republicans tend to view themselves as coming out better when fewer people vote. So more people vote, better for Democrats; fewer people vote, better for Republicans, is what even the data tells us. So there's obvious political motives in play to either deregulate or further regulate the electorate, and parties understand this and have an interest, right? So, what would happen if we stopped regulating the electorate? Would U.S. voter turnout rates likely increase? Likely, yeah. Yeah, and the fact of the matter is, there's really no evidence, even after the 2020 elections, in which the Justice Department, led by a Trump appointee, said that this was the 2020 presidential election was the freest and cleanest that has taken place in the United States, right? So there really is no issue of systemic voter fraud. Then President Trump in 2017 put together a voter fraud commission that was led by someone from my home state of Kansas, that was disbanded after it found no evidence of systemic voter fraud. I mean, this is not a politically charged statement; it's just a reflection of fact. But despite the fact that voting is still a politicized issue, nonetheless, and again, to repeat the theme here, many of us actively choose not to engage in it, right? Again, we're going back to this notion of rational ignorance. We don't have time. We feel like our vote doesn't have an impact. We feel like maybe we aren't as connected to society as we feel we need to be to vote. We feel like we don't have any meaningful choices. Um, and it could be that, we feel like neither party pays attention to us. I think that's kind of a cop out, though, to not vote because the parties don't speak to you. Well, they can't speak to everyone, and it's on us as voters to make a choice. But I do understand, perhaps more readily, the no time to become informed, the sense that your vote has little impact, or that you don't feel as connected to society, or that you don't have meaningful choices. I think in 2016, that was clearly, for the presidential race, a case of a lot of people feeling like they didn't have meaningful choices, that they didn't really like either candidate. But anyway, what difference does it make if people don't vote? Again, I've already touched on this, so I won't hammer this anymore. But this tends to affect Democrats more when people don't turn out to vote. Um, and whether you identify with the Republicans or the Democrats, you should. I would hope that logically, consciously, you would reach the conclusion that if more people were to vote, we would collectively have greater legitimacy. We would view our government with greater legitimacy, right? If the people in power represent more and more votes, then I think that represents a higher level of legitimacy. If only about half of us turn out to vote, and half of us vote one way and half of us vote another, what you've got is only about a quarter of the population who actually voted for the person in the White House, whether they're a Republican or a Democrat, right? So I think your friendly neighborhood political science professor tends to think that we should want to vote in higher numbers. We should do what we can to get more people out to vote. But again, this is a politically charged issue because it's well known by those in government, whether that's in Washington or Austin or Montpelier, Vermont, that if more people turned out to vote, more elections would go one way or for one party over another. But anyway, shifting gears, zooming out, this is my last set of slides here, thinking about presidential elections. When we go vote, if you voted, say, in November of 2020, that was a general election, and a general election is one that includes the president. When you go vote for president, you will vote for to decide who will be your member in the House, of which each of us as individuals only have one. We all live in one district, and that's the district we vote in, and we elect one member to represent that district. Every 4 years in a general election, we collectively elect about 1/3 of the Senate. If you'll recall, senators serve 6-year terms, and there are 100 senators, 2 per state. And so every 2 years, come election time, the 2 years when there's not a presidential election, we call these midterm elections, referring to the term of the president. We'll vote for another 2/3 of the Senate. And then on any given ballot, we could have various state and local offices up for grabs as well. Usually it's the presidential candidates who just suck all of the air out of the room, politically speaking, metaphorically speaking, come election time. I mean, think back to September, August, of 2020 and think about all you saw on the news, on your stupid news feeds. Even the least political among us probably was tired of hearing about the election by the time it rolled around. That's how I felt for about the last 4 or 5 rounds of presidential elections in my adult lifetime. But anyway, um, so you want to run for president. Where do you begin? The textbook talks pretty realistically. I appreciate that about how this works. There's a lot of behind the scenes work that goes on for pretty much the entirety from the time that the previous presidential election ends to the time that candidates make their announcements as candidates. You know, at October, November of 2021, I'm sure pretty much everyone who will eventually throw their hat into the ring to run, either as a Democrat or Republican, likely as a Republican since there's a Democratic incumbent, but likely everyone who's thought about running for president and will run for president is thinking about running for president right now. So it starts early. Getting the nomination is the primary process. And that really kicks off in February, late January, early February of the presidential election year. The Iowa caucuses, the New Hampshire primaries, Super Tuesday, et cetera, the conventions, so on and so forth. And once there is a nominee, then the nominee's job is to rally the party, to get more people involved, to rally the base, and to turn out the vote, right? That's how presidential elections work. But that's not to say that we engage in a national vote, right? We know this. I've talked about the Electoral College a time or two thus far in the semester already. It is undoubtedly the most important institution to become president, right? And it's distributed by state. Remember that the votes are allocated by state, and the vote count is based upon the representation in Congress for each state. So each state has two for the two senators, and then the equivalent number of votes in the Electoral College as members of the House of Representatives. So Texas in 2020 only had 36, only, it's the second largest state, 36 members in the House, plus 2 members in the Senate, 38 electoral votes. After the 2020 census results were published, Texas picked up 2 seats in the House. We'll have 40 votes in the Electoral College until the results of the 2030 census come out. But you need to win the Electoral College to win the White House. And I've got 2 maps to show you after this slide, and that'll be it. That'll illustrate the point. But before I get to the maps, what goes into a winning campaign? Obviously, a smart team, a sharp and memorable message, free media helps a lot. Candidate Trump, as far back as 2015, was very good at attracting the attention of the media in its entirety and gained a lot of free press coverage. Money, of course, is very important to pay for ads when you can't run on free media. GOTV has nothing to do with Game of Thrones V. It means get out the vote. Right, so parties engage in get out the vote campaigns where they turn to the base and try to motivate people to actually get to the polls to vote on election day. And then, of course, to win the presidency, you need to win swing states. And swing states are ones that could go for one party or another come election day in the presidential vote. So here is here are the results of the Electoral College from 2016, and hopefully you can see my cursor here as I scroll across. But when we think of swing states, really some of the quintessential swing states at present are probably these up here in what we call the Rust Belt. Pennsylvania is, I think, after Florida, the oldest state by average age in the union, which might not surprise you that it voted for Republicans in 2016 for Trump, but traditionally has voted for Democrats. Michigan the same, Wisconsin the same, Ohio, I think, has never not voted for the Democrat when the presidency has been won by a Democrat. Ohio is one of these that voting for Republicans might not be an indicator, but if a Democrat wins Ohio, they're likely going to win the whole of the Electoral College. Florida goes back and forth. I think in the year 2000, it famously voted for George W. Bush. I think it did in 2004 again. It voted for Obama in 2008, and I want to say in 2012, 2008 for sure. But it's a swing state. North Carolina is increasingly a swing state, one viewed traditionally as a Republican state, but in 2008 voted for Obama. If we fast forward to 2020, you can see a little bit of change here. Pennsylvania went blue again, as did Michigan, as did Wisconsin. Georgia was a bit of a wild card. It's been traditionally, as we've seen since the 1968 presidential campaign with Nixon, that the South on the whole has been pretty Republican. That looks like it might be in a state of flux. I don't know what the next southern state to go blue might be. North Carolina again, maybe. I don't know. Texas in the longer term future, I do not know. I feel like a lot of the recent demographic change in Texas is going to favor Democrats in the longer term, but we'll see. Arizona, surprisingly, has become what we would call a swing state. In recent elections, it had not voted for a Democrat, but did in 2020. But anyway, that's where I'm at there. This is my last slide for Chapter 8, but do zoom out from elections a bit, and as you watch inequality for all, think about inequality as an electoral issue. Think about the previous chapter we read. Think about how interest groups and even political parties deal with, dodge the issue of inequality. But I think it's going to be one that's going to be with us for a while politically, and it's worth your time to think about. So I'm going to stop here, but be in touch. And I'm sorry I went 50 minutes, a little longer than I wanted to, but there we are. Anyway, be in touch as you need. Take care.